Yeah, so Dr. Olukotun is the Cadence Design Systems Professor in the engineering department at Stanford, and he's a professor in the departments of electrical engineering and computer science. He also leads the Data Analytics for What's Next, or Dawn Lab, dedicated to increasing access to artificial intelligence for ordinary people. Outside of Stanford, Dr. Olukotun is a pioneer in the technology industry, known as the father of the multi-core processor. He's been featured in Forbes Magazine, CNBC, Wired, and more, and is the recipient of the IEEE Computer Society Harry H. Goode Award. Thank you, Dr. Olukotun, for being here today to share your story with the more than 50 viewers and all of the other students that this recording will be shown to. So let's get started.
Well, thank you very much for having me and inviting me to chat with you and with everybody else who's tuning in to the webinar. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm really impressed with what Curieus is doing to help close the gap in opportunity and access to STEM, which is a very important problem, given that if you look at the numbers and the importance of STEM in society, and how important it is that everybody have access to this sort of learning. So with that, I'd be glad to answer the questions that you have and any of the audience members have later.
Yeah, so I guess we're going to start from the beginning with our first question, which is, what was your upbringing like, and how do you think it led to where you are today?
That's a good question. I've got a very interesting and varied background. I was born in London, UK, in North London, in the early 1960s. And as a boy, growing up in an area of London called Highbury, it's called North London. And if you're anybody who is a premier soccer fan, they'll know that there's a team called Arsenal that comes from the Highbury area. And so I'm a big Arsenal supporter, always have been. And, so the two things I loved growing up as a boy in London was sort of, building things of all sorts, and then, playing and watching football, right? And so that's what I did for most of my days. And so the thing that really kind of set me on the electrical engineering path was, a teacher I had in primary school in grades 3 and 4, actually 5 and 6, and this person's name was called Brian Pike. And Brian Pike saw that I was kind of interested in science, and he, gave me. He was also, very interested in science, and so, he kind of inspired my passion for these sorts of things and doing experiments. And he would give me both the resources and the time to go and work on my own experiments, right? And so, I remember coming to him one day and saying, I'm really interested in sort of, electricity and magnetism. And he said, well, let's go get some wire, let's get a power supply, and let's build an electromagnet. And it's really cool to understand that, hey, you can take a bolt, an iron bolt, and you can wrap wire around it and connect it to a battery, and all of a sudden you've got a magnet, right? And that was pretty interesting to me, as a 4th grader. And then the next thing I thought, well, how do electric motors work, right? How can you make an electric motor? And he said, well, you can make an electric motor. It's an extension of this electromagnet that you've built. And so we went to the library. And we figured out how you could make a very simple electric motor, and so we got the parts together, and I remember he said you can take the electric the power supply home and work on it at home. And so I would, lug this stuff back to my home. It wasn't too far. It's about a kind of 5 or 6 minute walk from school to home. And I would, I remember one Saturday morning, actually getting the motor to work. And it was the thrill of my life. This idea that you could, if anybody's played with an electric motor before, the key thing is to get the magnets to switch at the right time so that you get the rotational motion, right? So it's called a commutator, is the part of the electric motor that really does this switching, and you got to get it at just the right angles. And I just remember that Saturday morning when I first got that motion, the motor to work and start turning, and as I said, I can still remember the thrill of that. And so, working with things, and then we built all sorts of things, right? We built burglar alarms, and then I moved on to model planes and boats, and I got really interested in radio-controlled airplanes. And I remember, my dad would take me down to the local model shop, and I would kind of lust over the different kinds of model planes that were available, and the RC radio control technology and this was in the early 70s, so things of course were pretty primitive. Of course, nowadays every little kid can have a radio controlled car, but in those days this was a really exotic technology for people to play with. And I did, parents didn't have enough money to actually buy these things, but I did have a classmate who was kind of, much more well off, and his father liked model planes. So I'd go over to his house and play with these things. And so, that was kind of what inspired me to kind of be interested in electrical engineering. And then when I got to 6th grade, my parents decided to move back to Nigeria. And so I, of course, moved with them to Nigeria. And I went through middle school and high school in Nigeria. I didn't have the access to the same sorts of things I had in London, but I was still continue to pursue math and science and do a lot of reading that kind of also inspired me. I remember there was a special issue of Scientific American in '79 that was focusing on the integrated circuit technology, this idea that you can put multiple what are called transistors, which are electronic switches, on a integrated circuit and build interesting devices that way. So that's what got me interested in science and technology and being an electrical engineer. And that's all I wanted to do from a very early age.
Yeah, that's so awesome to hear that you had amazing mentors like Brian Pike growing up, and was able to like play around and basically see the like awe-inspiring nature of science and electrical engineering by doing. We also believe that like learning by doing is sort of the best method, and so that's something that we try to do in our after-school programs. So my next question is, so you talked about the importance of education and teachers and classmates growing up, and now you're a teacher, you're a professor at Stanford on top of your work in technical companies. What can you say about like the impact of education and teaching on where a student ends up, and how do you try to, what is your philosophy for teaching?
That's a very good question. So before I, get into that question, let me just say a little bit about what I do, right? What my area of work, and then I'll come back and answer your question, because I think it has some pertinence to your question. So, so as I said, I started out in sort of thinking about electromechanical things, and then when I got to college, I really, focused on electronics, and I got introduced to the world of digital electronics, right? Which is basically using transistors as switches, right? And you think about a light switch. Well, a transistor is essentially just a electronic silicon switch, right? But you basically are doing the same sort of function, the notion that you have some way of controlling the current through the transistor. And it turns out that if you put lots of transistors together, you can build pretty interesting things like computers, right? You know, computers are made out of transistors, and the whole idea of sort of how you put these circuits together to build different kinds of computers is known, the field is known as computer architecture, right? And because, you know, it has some relation to building architecture, right? So building architecture is how you design a building or a house, and how the rooms are arranged such that you get the right sort of flow of people through the house, or so that, you know, you have different rooms for different functions, and they're well laid out, and they service the whole goal of providing accommodation, or providing an office building for a company. So computer architecture also has some goals, right? The goals might be, oh, let's design a computer which is very efficient and uses a very little small amounts of power, or let's design a very fast computer that can compute huge amounts with huge amounts of data at any one time, or let's design a very small computer that fits in a small space, or let's combine all of the above, and then you get the smartphone that you've got in your pocket, right? You know, it's small, it's fast, it uses very little power, and it does everything, right? I mean, it's an amazing device, and it's all enabled by, you know, silicon technology, and silicon technology is driven by something called Moore's law. So many people may have heard of Moore's law, but let me just tell you a bit about it, because it's kind of an important idea in the evolution of the Silicon Valley and the evolution of computing, and where we are today, with computing being such a big component of everyone's lives. So Moore's law was coined in 1965 by a guy named Gordon Moore, who was a former chairman of Intel and one of the founders of Intel. And basically what he said was, back in the 1960s, that you can double the number of transistors that you put on a silicon chip roughly every year or 18 months, right? So what that means is, of course, that every year you can do more for the same amount of money, or you can do what you did last year for half the amount of money, right? And so this is what has driven computing. It becomes cheaper and faster and more capable, and now, you know, it's everywhere, right? You know, where are we today? Well, you know, this is a chip that I'll show you. It's from a recent company that I found. It's called Sambonova, and it's a chip that's got 40 billion transistors on it, right? That's 5 transistors for every man, woman, and child on Earth. And it's used for actually doing very sophisticated artificial intelligence computations that could be used for analyzing medical images, or doing real-time speech recognition and translation for hundreds of simultaneous features, and all sorts of other interesting things. And of course, layering on top of the silicon is very multiple layers of sophisticated software. Okay, so back to the question of sort of, what can I say about the impact of education and teaching, as to where the students end up. So, I'm a professor first, right? I've done lots of things in my life, but the thing that kind of gives me the most joy is really being a professor and teaching and working with both undergraduates and graduate students. And I was particularly pleased to see, of course, this is Black History Month, and so this is the month in which I get a lot of middle schoolers who send me requests for information, right? And one that is typical, but a little out of the ordinary, is one I received recently from a person in Western Arkansas called Daniel Eckert. And Daniel Eckert said, my teacher has given us the task of honoring a science or technologist of African descent, and I chose you because my father was astounded at the fact that that you had created this idea called the multi-core CPU, which is the idea of having multiple processing cores on a CPU, among your other accomplishments. And he said, this has changed the world. And so then he said, well, of all your many accomplishments and inventions, what are you the most proud, and what do you consider the most important to mankind? And I reply to him. This was one of the more insightful questions I get. Typical the questions are who are your superhero? What's your favorite superhero? Or something that isn't quite as insightful. But this is a really interesting question. And I told him that I was most proud of working with students to help them reach their potential. And that that everything that I do is a collaboration, right? And engineering is a collaboration, right, between myself and my students, or myself and my colleagues, and that when we get to something that is a significant goal, the credit multiplies, right? It doesn't divide. Everybody gets to share in the credit. And even though maybe I was the leader, I'm not the one who does most of the work, right? And so it's important to me that the students who work on the with me, and the people who work with me, kind of reach their maximum potential, right? And that's the most important thing that I've done in my career, is sort of helping people reach their potential, because everybody has the potential. Everybody who kind of goes into science and engineering, and those are the people I see, right, in both the undergraduate and the graduate level, they have the potential to do interesting and potentially great things, and I want to see them to get there. And it's about helping them find they come in naturally curious, and helping kind of drive that curiosity in ways that I think are going to be productive. They might say, oh, here's an idea, and I'll say, that's a good idea, but there was this paper that was published 10 years ago that looked at that idea, and it didn't pan out. But things might have changed, right? The great thing about technology is ideas that may not have been good 10 years ago, after you've got 10 years of Moore's law doubling, now you've got a lot more resources to play with, and so those ideas may now make sense. So it's always good to revisit old ideas. And the great thing about working with students is they're not shackled by the old ideas, right? They come in without preconceived notions. They just come in with raw intelligence and enthusiasm and capability, and that's what keeps me interested and working at the university, is the thrill of working with great students.
Yeah, and that's definitely a huge part of Curious's mission, is the working directly with students and working with that curiosity, which can take you anywhere. So,
Right.
So to that point about increasing access and working with curiosity, given your work at the Dawn Lab at Stanford, which for the audience, I mentioned it briefly earlier, but it's to make it easier to use AI for applications for people who don't have as much of a technical background. What
Right.
can you say about the future, given that work at the lab, of increasing access to STEM?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a really important question, and it's a much broader question than we are trying to look at the Dawn Lab, right? At the Dawn Lab, the focus was sort of how could we make it easier for companies or for researchers that weren't focused on AI to use AI techniques, right? So, machine learning and AI has been tremendous in its capability of solving problems, from, recognizing images to speech translation and understanding to self-driving cars. But all of these things have been pioneered and enabled in large companies like Google and Facebook and Amazon that have huge amounts of resources, huge amounts of computing capability, huge numbers of scientists to try and understand how to use these AI models. And so what we wanted to do in Dawn is make this whole process of building models and using them for the purposes that you might want easier, right? So providing an easier path to the use of AI technology. But the broader question is sort of how do we make access easier for people, especially if people of underrepresented groups, I think is actually more challenging and more important question, right? I mean, I think we're at a point here where we all understand the power of STEM and the benefit of a STEM education and both the sort of rewards, the monetary rewards that come, but also the rewards that come from working in this area, the satisfaction of kind of doing STEM work, and as I said, the collaboration and the impact that one can have on improving their society. And of course, we want the maximum number of our citizens or the citizens of the world to participate in this. And if you look at the numbers that we have in of especially Black students going into STEM, it's far smaller than the fraction of the population of the majority of white students going into STEM, right? And so the question is, how to improve those numbers. And I think, as you, Curieus, have rightly pointed out, it starts out in the lower grades, right? You've got to improve access to math and science when students are young, so that they can develop the capabilities and expertise and curiosity to move forward as they move up the education ladder to the point where they are, competitive and capable of kind of, getting into STEM majors and being successful. And so I think, all of that is important. And I think it's both a question of what one does, in the K through 12 elementary grades, but also the macro environment, right, that exists in the country or locally in California, for example, right? So one of the recent articles I read that you might be aware of is a article that says, after years of gains, Black STEM representation is falling, and the question is why, right? And so if you look at the graphs, what you see is that there's been this steady rise in Black STEM graduation across the nation up until the early 2000s, and then you see a decline, right? And this is particularly troubling because, of course, we know the continued importance of STEM to the competitiveness of the nation, to the economic improvement of the individuals engaged in STEM, and to fostering a larger number of representatives of URM that can inspire and serve as role models for those coming behind, right? And so the question is why is things falling? And there were many kinds of reasons that were laid out, but kind of the main one has been basically the retreat from affirmative action, right? And so the large-scale retreat from specific programs and policies that consider race in admissions, recruitment, and retention in higher education has basically led to this decline. And so you want to both do the things within, I have within my research group, if I compare the number of Black and URM students that I've had in my research group versus research groups from my colleagues, I've got more, right? For obvious reasons, right? And so you want to try and move the numbers at every level, but you also want the macro societal environment to also help, right? So it's a systemic problem that can only be solved by systemic solutions, right? And so the stuff that you're doing is great. Maybe the stuff I'm doing locally is fine, but we also we need a societal effort in making an improvement in the situation that we have.
Yeah, thank you so much for that super thorough overview of the issue as a systemic problem and what we can do to solve that. That was really empowering to hear from us about, like, from our work at Curieus, and also it was really inspiring to hear how you're working towards that sort of equitable solution in your work as well. Mm-hmm. And so I was wondering, so you talked about you mentioned the statistics regarding Black and underrepresented and minority representation in STEM. How has your own background as a person of color shaped your experiences in the field?
Yeah, so that's a very, very good question. So as when I came to Stanford about almost 30 years ago, I, of course, done well as a PhD student, and I came to Stanford and from the University of Michigan, and like many people who come to Stanford, you have the imposter syndrome, right? What am I doing here? They make a mistake, and it's kind of further compounded by the fact that I'm minority Black person, in which to a large extent that there may be maybe two of us in the whole department, right? And that was electrical engineering and zero in CS, right? At the time. At some point, I became a joint faculty member, so I got to count. And so you are concerned that you have is you're a minority, you are a junior professor, and everybody's looking at you, and you're wondering, well, whatever I say, am I just being looked at as this is an example of am I speaking for just myself, or am I speaking for my whole race, right? And so that is something, of course, that comes up. And this is something that, of course, if I was in the majority, I wouldn't have to contend with. So, I mean, there's this fundamental notion that one of the privileges of being in the majority is not having to think about your social, about issues like that, right? Because you just take it as is. But of course, over time, I became successful. I became very comfortable with my environment. I understood what was going on. I got tenure. Basically, if you get tenure, you essentially can't be fired unless you kind of break the law in certain ways. And so then, I became, the majority in the sense that I was a successful Stanford professor. And at that point, it didn't matter, what I said. I was saying it from the point of view of a person who was prominent, who had lots of success, and therefore I felt certainly less self-conscious about what I was saying. So the fact that I've already mentioned the fact that being a Black faculty member meant that I attracted Black PhD students, right? And so that was certainly the case. And also, of course, you get asked to do all sorts of things that because you're one of the few Black faculty members in the department or in the School of Engineering are associated with speaking to URM graduate students, going to recruit in certain places, and doing all sorts of things around diversity and inclusion that potentially, if I was not Black, would not be an issue, right? So there's these two issues. One is there's extra work that you do because you're a minority, and it's not something that you feel like you don't want to do. It's something that you want to do because you want to be an ally. You want to make it possible for as many people that look like you to have an opportunity to do the things that we do in the university. And so anything you can do is fine. But of course, that's extra burdens that you have to do that you wouldn't have to do if you were part of the majority. So in that sense, there's both this notion of sort of, how are you being viewed? And then there's this extra work that you do that goes on.
Yeah, I think that's super interesting. I think it's really important to understand sort of the extra work that comes with exposure, but then the importance of exposure in tandem. So we'll be starting the audience Q&A section now. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to ask them in the Q&A section. But the first question we have here today comes from Emily, and it's about sort of the intersection of electrical engineering and climate change. She asks, how do massive issues like climate change shape the future of electrical engineering, especially given what's happening today in Texas with the massive power outages and the sort of outdated technology that we see happening?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I will try to answer, but I will preface my answer by saying that electrical engineering is the broadest department probably in the university, right? It goes from everywhere from power generation, right, which is what this question is about, power generation and distribution, which, by the way, just a little history. Back in the old days of electrical engineering, every electrical engineer had to take a course in what was called rotating machinery, right? And that was about electric motors and generating electricity and transmitting it. That is no longer a required course. It was never a required course in my history, and I've been in the field 40 years, right? So, so there's a part of electrical engineering that does this power generation thing that a lot of electrical engineers don't know much about, including me. And then on the other extreme, there's this whole idea of sort of how you do MRI imaging, right? Which is a very sophisticated signal processing technology. That's also part of electrical engineering. And then in between, you've got people who do digital electronics, how your mobile phones are designed. You've got people who do what are called analog electronics, which is sort of how electronics communicates with the physical world, and a lot of stuff in between. So back to your question. So I think the key solving the problems of global warming have to do with sort of how we use energy, right? Right. So the problem in Texas was really about, hey, they had a bunch of generation capability that they didn't winterize, right? And so the winter came, the cold weather came along and knocked all their plants offline, right? They had natural gas plants, and they couldn't deliver the gas, and they couldn't, start up the generation. So that, that was an issue that is kind of particular to Texas. The global issue of how we produce and use energy, that's what's going to contribute to global warming, right? So one of the things that we need to figure out how to do is to stop burning fossil fuels for transportation, right? That's a key user of energy. And so what you want is cheap, efficient electric cars. And what is that about? It's about both how do you design very, very, very efficient electric motors, but also how do you control them with computer control such that they use the least amount of electricity power in providing the mechanical forward motion or backward motion, depending on whether you're going forward or reverse, whatever. Anyway, so I think electric cars are going to be, incredibly important. And then the other thing is, all the computation that goes on today, right? So there's a combination of sort of, what you do with your personal computation devices in your pocket, and those, of course, as I already mentioned, have to be designed such that they use very little power, because otherwise, your battery wouldn't last very long, right? So the first mobile phones, right? The battery was a suitcase, which was much bigger than the phone, right? Because that was the state of the electronics of the day. Now we're at this point where everything fits in a small package, and the battery is still the biggest component almost of the whole device, but it's all about very, very efficient electronics. That's great. But what about the infrastructure that allows your mobile phone to use? The cellular network, the big servers at Amazon and Google and Facebook and all the other big internet companies that give you your services. There's a huge amount. If you ever go into one of these data centers, they're football fields size, multiple football field size, filled with computers. And those computers are consuming huge amounts of energy. And so, every time that you ask Siri for something, we could probably figure out how much power is required to service that query. And so an important component of minimizing their energy footprint is trying to understand how to design systems that both give you what you want, but also minimize the amount of energy. So, it's all wrapped up in sort of computation and new technologies. What we do for computation in the data center and in your pocket, what we do for transportation, going, for personal cars and for trucks, and trying to understand, how can you do things more efficiently? And thinking about computation is always about doing things more efficiently, right? You want to distribute a bunch of packages from Amazon to your home. How can we minimize the amount of miles traveled such that everybody gets their package and everybody gets it on time? This is a computation problem, right? This is a problem that can be optimized, right? And then hopefully those trucks that are actually moving those packages around are running on electric power.
Yeah. So first, like the explanation about the breadth of the electrical engineering, I mean, first also answers one of our other audience questions, but also is super key. I think a lot of people kind of just clump it as one, but it's so diverse. And then in terms of like talking about efficiency specifically in sort of processing, we have a question here from Edwin about what do you think the impact of quantum computing will be, especially for the future? I know it's sort of an emerging technology, but especially when it comes to efficiency, what do you think that'll look like in the future?
That's a really interesting question. Quantum computing has been something that has been on the cusp of realization for the last 50 years. I think it's going to be important for certain very particular algorithms. Quantum computing is very useful for factoring large numbers into their prime factors. Quantum computing is useful for trying to model quantum systems, right? So if you are trying to model materials and how materials interact and how the different molecular structures of materials lead to their properties, then if you want to model that, then maybe a quantum computer that's actually, you might almost think of that as what's called an analog model, right? Here's a model of something that has quantum computing, quantum characteristics, and we want to model that with a quantum computer. But for I don't see quantum computing maybe in my career, say another 20 years, really supplanting classical computing for the wide variety of things that we use computation today. So I think it can be incredibly powerful for a narrow range of things, and that's the prediction, right? So we can't build quantum computers today that are big enough, that have enough what are called qubits, which are quantum bits, to do things that can beat a classical computer today. So there's almost no problem that I can come up with that I can run on today's quantum computer that could be a classical computer. And sort of whether we get to the point in the next 10 years when I can pick a problem, give me any problem in which if I run it on a quantum computer, it will be faster than if I run it on a classical computer, then I think things will be interesting, but we're not there yet.
Yeah. And unfortunately, for the sake of time, this is our last question, but I do think that it's kind of thematically important for today's webinar. Elisa asked, what would be one systemic change or reform you would like to see implemented to improve access to STEM education to minority kids all over the nation?
I think, we try to do it from on the last ballot, right? You want to reinstitute affirmative action, right? So Prop 209, I think, should be repealed, right? And that, as I said, you look at the numbers, right? And the numbers are stark, and we know what works or what has worked. So why don't we keep on doing what has worked and see if we can continue the upward trend that we had before we decided that we would stop doing what was working. So that's what I would do systemically. What else? I mean, I think it's a really big and complex problem, as you know, and so there's the question asks for one thing, and that's the one thing I would bring up, because it's something that you can think of tangibly doing. But you want to do all the things that we understand. You want to have very good preschool education. You want to have a rich primary education. I give examples. Sort of, one of the things I see today at primary schools, I see a lot of learning that isn't as what I would call curiosity based as I would like to see, right? It's not, it's not as I described as something that an experiment led by the or a curriculum led by the curiosity of the student. I mean, you've got to have some structure, but I think in some cases I see too much structure and not enough freedom to explore. And so that's something that I would like to see in some of the earlier grades. But yeah.
Yeah, that's, that last answer is super apropos for Curious's mission, hence the name Curious.
Yeah.
It's all about fostering curiosity and love of learning through hands-on things.
Right.
And I think your answers really touched on the importance of that. So that was super helpful. We were so glad to have you here, Dr. Olukotun, and answer these questions. I think every answer was super well thought out and helpful. But thank you so much for joining us. And for answering all these questions, the audience questions. It was great to have you here, and Curious is super thankful.
Well, thank you, Alexandra, Rachel, and Maya for inviting me. It was fun, and hopefully we can do this again sometime. Yeah, bye.
Thank you.